Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains was the small town of Black Hollow, a place few ventured into and even fewer dared to leave. The town's name carried an air of foreboding, whispered in neighboring communities as a place best avoided. It wasn't on any major maps, and no one seemed to remember exactly when it was founded. Its existence was like a shadow, always there but never fully acknowledged. Life in Black Hollow moved slowly, shrouded in secrecy. The townsfolk were peculiar, their pale faces and hollow eyes betraying a history of sleepless nights and unspoken fears. Outsiders were treated with polite suspicion, their every move watched with an intensity that made their skin crawl. Despite its eerie atmosphere, Black Hollow had an inexplicable pull, like a siren song luring those brave or foolish enough to visit. Ellie Warren was one such visitor, a journalist with a penchant for uncovering the unknown. She had heard whispers of the town's dark history, stories of disappearances, strange rituals, and an inexplicable hum that filled the air on moonless nights. Determined to uncover the truth, she packed her recording equipment and drove into the heart of the mountains. Her first impression of Black Hollow was unsettling. The streets were eerily empty, save for a few residents who stared at her as if she were an apparition. The town had no cell service, and the only lodging was a crumbling inn run by a gaunt woman named Mabel, whose sunken eyes seemed to pierce Ellie's soul. "You'll want to lock your door at night," Mabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if you hear the humming, don't open your window." Ellie laughed nervously, brushing off the warning as small-town superstition. That night, as she settled into her room, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The wallpaper peeled in jagged strips, revealing strange symbols carved into the wood beneath. The air was heavy, thick with an almost electric charge. At exactly 3 a.m., Ellie woke to a low, resonant hum. It was unlike anything she'd ever heard, both melodic and dissonant, as if the earth itself were groaning in agony. Her curiosity overpowered her fear, and she approached the window. Peering through the curtains, she saw shadows moving in the distance, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. The next morning, Ellie tried to ask the townsfolk about the hum. Most ignored her, their faces tightening at the mention of it. Only one man, a grizzled farmer named Joseph, dared to speak. "It's the hollow song," he said, his voice trembling. "It calls to them, the ones beneath." "The ones beneath?" Ellie pressed, her heart racing. Joseph looked around nervously before leaning in. "There's a reason no one leaves Black Hollow. The town was built over something. They say the founders made a pact, offered sacrifices to keep the peace. But the hollow song, it's a warning. When you hear it, they're coming." Ellie's rational mind struggled to process his words, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. Determined to uncover the truth, she ventured into the woods that night, armed with a flashlight and her recorder. The trees loomed like skeletal hands, their branches clawing at the starless sky. The hum began again, louder this time, reverberating through her chest like a heartbeat. As she pushed deeper into the forest, she stumbled upon a clearing. In its center was a massive stone altar, slick with a dark, viscous substance that glistened in the dim light. Surrounding it were the same symbols she had seen in her room, carved into the ground with meticulous precision. Before she could react, Ellie heard footsteps, soft but deliberate. She spun around, her flashlight revealing a group of townsfolk emerging from the shadows, their faces blank and eyes glassy. They moved in unison, their lips mouthing silent words as the hum grew deafening. "You shouldn't have come here," Mabel's voice rang out, though her expression was vacant. "You've seen too much." Ellie backed away, her heart pounding as she tripped over a root and fell to the ground. The group advanced, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Just as they reached her, the ground beneath the altar began to crack, a blinding light spilling forth. From the fissure emerged a figure, indescribable and otherworldly, its form shifting and pulsating as if it were made of pure energy. Ellie's scream was swallowed by the hum, now impossibly loud. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the creature extending a tendril toward her, its touch icy and searing all at once. Ellie woke in her car, parked at the edge of the forest. Her equipment was gone, and her memory of the night was fragmented like a shattered mirror. When she returned to the inn, it was as if she had never been there. The building was abandoned, its windows boarded up and covered in years of dust. Black Hollow was gone from her GPS, its location erased as if it had never existed. But Ellie knew the truth. She could still hear the hum, faint and distant, a reminder of what lay beneath the earth and the price of uncovering its secrets.
Story number 2.
The town of Gallows Reach sat perched on a cliff overlooking the gray, churning sea. It was a town of whispers, where even the wind carried secrets through the crooked streets. The people who lived there knew better than to speak of the shadow that hung over their home. Outsiders didn't stay long, but those who did rarely left the same, or at all. Hannah Gable arrived in Gallows Reach on a cold autumn evening, seeking solitude after a bitter divorce. The town's isolation and rustic charm seemed like the perfect place to start anew. She had rented a small cottage near the edge of the cliff, its windows looking out over the endless ocean. The locals were polite but distant, and their eyes often darted to the horizon when they spoke to her. On her third night in the cottage, Hannah was jolted awake by the sound of heavy footsteps outside her window. Heart-pounding, she peeked through the curtains, but there was nothing there. Only the faint glow of the moon casting eerie shadows across the yard. She convinced herself it was the wind playing tricks on her, and went back to bed. The following morning, she found something peculiar. In the dirt outside her cottage was a perfect circle of footprints, too large and irregular to be human. They trailed off toward the cliff's edge, disappearing as if whoever or whatever had made them had walked straight into the sea. Hannah brought it up casually to the woman at the general store, who froze mid-sentence. "You didn't go outside, did you?" the woman asked, her voice low and urgent. "No, why?" Hannah replied, unnerved. The woman hesitated, her knuckles white as she gripped the counter. "Just keep your windows locked at night." That evening, Hannah sat by the fire, the uneasy conversation replaying in her mind. As the hours passed, the wind outside began to howl, rattling the shutters. Then came the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling the cottage. This time, she didn't look. Instead, she sat frozen in her chair, gripping the poker from the fireplace as if it could protect her from whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then came the knocking, a heavy, deliberate sound on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Hannah's breath hitched as she crept toward the door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind and the relentless knocking. She pressed her eye to the peephole, but saw nothing. When she finally mustered the courage to open the door, there was no one there, only the same large, misshapen footprints leading away from her porch. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her pulse racing. That night, she barely slept, and when she did, she dreamed of shadows moving beneath the water, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The next day, she decided to leave, but when she tried to start her car, it wouldn't budge. The engine sputtered and died, and the road out of town seemed to stretch endlessly into the mist. Desperate, she walked to the local tavern, hoping to hire someone to take her to the nearest city. As she entered, the conversation stopped. The room fell silent, and every head turned to her. Their faces were blank, their expressions devoid of emotion. "I need help," she stammered. "I need to leave." One of the men stood, his eyes dull and lifeless. "No one leaves Gallows Reach," he said, his voice flat and monotone. Panic set in as Hannah backed away, but the townsfolk didn't move. They simply stared, their unblinking eyes following her as she fled into the mist. The sound of the ocean grew louder, almost deafening, as she ran back to her cottage. When she arrived, she found the front door wide open, the furniture overturned, and strange symbols carved into the walls. That night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It came from every window, every wall, as if the house itself were alive. She huddled in the corner, clutching the fireplace poker as the air grew thick and suffocating. Then everything went still. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. It spoke her name, drawn out and distorted as if from a great distance. She closed her eyes, praying it was a dream. When she opened them, she saw the source of the voice, a figure standing in the doorway, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The next morning, the cottage was empty. The townsfolk went about their business as if nothing had happened, their faces blank and their eyes unseeing. No one spoke of Hannah, and no one dared approach the cliff, where a new set of footprints led into the sea. The people of Gallows Reach knew better than to ask questions. They had learned long ago that some answers were best left buried beneath the waves.
Story number 3.
The town of Wrenwood was known for its quiet charm. A single main street lined with quaint shops, picket-fenced yards, and a sense of timeless tranquility. But beneath its idyllic surface lay an unspoken rule. No one went near the Ironwood Asylum. Perched on a hill at the town's edge, the asylum had been abandoned for decades. Its jagged silhouette stood against the sky like a scar, its windows dark and uninviting. Stories swirled about what had happened there. Cruel experiments, strange disappearances, and whispers of something far worse. Most townsfolk avoided the subject altogether, treating the asylum as if it didn't exist. For Clara Mitchell, however, the asylum was a mystery begging to be unraveled. A budding filmmaker with a fascination for the macabre, she decided to document the history of Ironwood for her next project. Equipped with a camera, a flashlight, and a stubborn sense of curiosity, she made her way to the imposing structure one crisp autumn evening. The air grew colder as Clara approached the asylum. Its iron gates stood ajar, rusted hinges creaking in the wind. Vines twisted around the crumbling facade, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. She hesitated, a shiver running down her spine, before stepping inside. The interior was worse than she imagined. Graffiti and debris littered the halls, but the deeper she ventured, the more pristine the asylum became, as though the decay had been stopped in its tracks. Doors were closed, beds neatly made, and wheelchairs stood eerily still in the corners of empty rooms. As Clara explored, she noticed something odd. The building seemed larger on the inside than it had appeared from the outside. Hallways stretched endlessly, their walls lined with rows of identical doors. A faint humming sound grew louder the farther she went, like the distant buzz of machinery. She entered a room marked Patient Records and began sifting through the dusty files. Most were mundane, listing the names and conditions of the asylum's long-deceased patients. But one file stood out. A thick, leather-bound folder labeled Project Echo. Inside were pages of cryptic notes, diagrams of brain scans, and photographs of patients strapped to machines with wires running from their skulls. The final page sent a chill through Clara. It read, "Subject containment compromised. Experiment failed. Facility evacuated." Below the text was a scrawled warning. "They are not gone. They are waiting." Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and the humming sound morphed into a low, resonant drone. Clara's flashlight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. She turned to leave, but found the hallway behind her different, longer, darker, and twisting in ways that defied logic. Her breathing quickened as she stumbled through the maze-like corridors. Doors creaked open as she passed, revealing glimpses of movement inside, pale hands clawing at the air, faces pressed against glass, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Clara's panic escalated when she heard footsteps echoing behind her, slow and deliberate. She turned her camera toward the sound, its night vision revealing a figure at the end of the hallway. It was humanoid, but wrong, its limbs unnaturally elongated and its face featureless, save for a wide, jagged grin. She ran, the figure's footsteps quickening to match her pace. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on themselves no matter which direction she turned. The hum grew deafening, pulsating like a heartbeat. Clara burst into a large room, its walls covered in mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her from every angle, except one. In the mirror directly ahead, there was no Clara, only the grinning figure, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. The lights went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Clara's screams echoed through the asylum, blending with the relentless hum. When the lights flickered back on, the room was empty, save for her camera lying on the floor, still recording. Weeks later, Clara's footage was found by a pair of hikers who had strayed too close to the asylum. The last scene showed her wide-eyed face, whispering frantically, "It's not the asylum, it's the thing inside. Don't let it see you." Her camera shut off abruptly, the hum rising one final time before the screen went black. The hikers handed the footage over to the authorities, but Clara was never found. The townsfolk shook their heads, muttering that the girl should have known better. No one dared approach the asylum again. But on quiet nights, when the wind was still, some claimed they could hear a faint humming sound coming from the hill, a sound that seemed to beckon, promising answers to questions no one was brave enough to ask.
Story number 4.
The small town of Ravenbrook was nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by dense forests that seemed to whisper secrets among themselves. With a population of just over 200, Ravenbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and outsiders were met with cautious curiosity. The town had an old-world charm, with cobblestone streets, historic buildings, and a central square that hosted a weekly farmers market. Yet, beneath its picturesque facade, Ravenbrook harbored a dark history that few dared to acknowledge. Lena Hartley had always been fascinated by local legends and the untold stories of small towns. When she inherited her grandmother's old farmhouse on the outskirts of Ravenbrook, she saw it as the perfect opportunity to escape the hustle of city life and delve into the town's mysterious past. Determined to uncover the truth behind the whispers that circulated among the townsfolk, Lena packed her bags and moved into the creaky house, eager to start her research. From the moment Lena arrived, she felt an unsettling presence. The air around the farmhouse was thick with an inexplicable tension, and the nights were filled with strange noises, soft footsteps, distant cries, and the occasional eerie lullaby carried by the wind. Despite these unnerving signs, Lena was resolute. She began interviewing longtime residents, piecing together the fragmented history of Ravenbrook. One elderly man, Mr. Thompson, recounted the town's founding. Ravenbrook was built on sacred ground, he said, his voice wavering. Long before the settlers arrived, this land was home to the Elders, a tribe that lived in harmony with nature. They had rituals and traditions that kept the balance between the living and the spirits. But as the town grew, those traditions were forgotten, and the balance was disrupted. Another resident, Mrs. Green, spoke of the annual Harvest Festival. It used to be a time of celebration and thanksgiving, she reminisced. But something changed 20 years ago. That year, the festival ended in tragedy. There were mysterious disappearances, and the joyous spirit turned dark. Since then, the festival has been a shadow of its former self, tainted by fear. Determined to get to the bottom of these mysteries, Lena decided to explore the old cemetery on the hill, a place locals avoided, especially after dark. The cemetery was overgrown, with crumbling tombstones and ancient trees casting long, twisted shadows. As she walked among the graves, Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of a child's laughter. She followed the sound to a secluded section of the cemetery where the ground seemed unnaturally disturbed. There, half buried under moss and dirt, was an old stone altar, adorned with symbols that matched those described in the town's legends. Lena's heart raced as she realized she had uncovered a place of old rituals, a remnant of the elders' attempts to maintain harmony. As night fell, Lena decided to stay in the cemetery to document her findings. She set up her camera and recorder, determined to capture any evidence of the supernatural. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the altar. Lena began to speak, recounting the history she had uncovered and expressing her hope to restore the town's forgotten traditions. Hours passed in uneasy silence until a faint humming began to fill the air. Lena's breath caught as shadows seemed to dance around her and the temperature dropped sharply. She heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, echoing through the cemetery. Turning towards the sound, she saw figures emerging from the darkness, ghostly apparitions clad in ancient garments, their eyes hollow and sorrowful. One of the spirits stepped forward, its voice a mere whisper carried by the wind. "The balance has been broken," it intoned. "Return what was taken, or suffer the consequences." Lena's mind raced, realizing the town's suffering was a direct result of abandoning the old ways. Summoning her courage, she pleaded, "What must I do to restore the balance?" The spirit extended a translucent hand, pointing towards the altar. Lena approached it, noticing an empty indentation where a sacred artifact should lie. She recalled the stories of the elders' relics, powerful objects used in their rituals. Determined to make amends, Lena vowed to find the missing artifact and perform the necessary rites. The apparitions began to fade, but the weight of the task ahead pressed heavily on her. Lena spent the following weeks researching the elders' traditions, consulting old texts, and deciphering the symbols she had found. Her quest led her to a hidden chamber beneath the town's church, where she discovered the missing relic, a beautifully crafted amulet imbued with ancient power. On the night of the next harvest festival, Lena returned to the cemetery. With the amulet in hand, She stood before the altar and began the ritual, reciting the chants she had meticulously learned. The air shimmered with energy as the amulet glowed, and the spirits reappeared, their presence now serene and grateful. As Lena completed the final incantation, a wave of warmth washed over the cemetery. The oppressive tension lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. The spirits smiled, their forms becoming one with the night as they ascended to the heavens. The Harvest Festival, once shrouded in fear, was transformed into a celebration of harmony and remembrance. Ravenbrook began to heal, the wounds of the past mending as the town embraced its heritage once more. Lena's bravery and determination not only uncovered the truth, but also restored the delicate balance between the living and the spirits. The town thrived, its secrets no longer hidden, but honored, ensuring that the legacy of the elders would endure for generations to come. Yet, late at night, when the wind is still, some say you can hear the faint echoes of Lena's footsteps in the cemetery, a reminder that some spirits never truly leave, and that the balance must always be respected.
Story number 5.
The town of Hollow Creek was like any other small town in America, quaint, unassuming, and seemingly frozen in time. It had a single diner where the locals gathered, a post office, and a church with a bell that rang every hour. Yet something about Hollow Creek felt wrong to outsiders. Visitors often remarked on the unnerving stillness, the way the townsfolk would pause conversations to watch them pass, and the strange metallic scent that hung faintly in the air. But what really set Hollow Creek apart was the woods. The locals called it the Black Veil. Stretching for miles beyond the edge of town, the forest was a tangled mass of gnarled trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. No one from Hollow Creek ventured into the Black Veil after sunset. Not anymore. The town had learned its lesson the hard way. When Caleb Hayes, a university student on break, arrived in Hollow Creek to visit his estranged aunt, he dismissed the warnings as superstition. His aunt, Martha, had been the town recluse for as long as Caleb could remember. Her rambling letters about the things in the woods had always seemed like the eccentric musings of a lonely old woman. But when Caleb arrived at her creaky, sagging house on the edge of the forest, she greeted him with a wild look in her eyes. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed, pulling him inside and bolting the door. "It's almost sundown. They'll be waking soon." "Who's they, Aunt Martha?" Caleb asked, bemused. Her response was barely above a whisper. "The Hollow Men." She refused to say more that night, instead drawing the curtains and lighting every lamp in the house. Caleb, skeptical but unsettled, decided he'd take a walk into the Black Veil the next day to prove to himself and his aunt that there was nothing to fear. The following afternoon, Caleb strapped on his hiking boots and ventured into the woods, armed with a flashlight and a camera. The Black Veil was denser than he expected. The trees seemed to lean closer together as he went deeper, their twisted branches blocking out the sun. The air grew colder, and that metallic scent he'd noticed in town became stronger, almost choking. As Caleb wandered, he noticed strange carvings on the trees, symbols he didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. He took pictures, noting how each carving seemed to form a trail, leading him farther from the edge of the forest. Hours passed, and Caleb realized with a start that the sun was setting. The woods grew darker, the shadows stretching and twisting unnaturally. Then he heard it, a low, guttural chant echoing through the trees. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Heart-pounding, Caleb turned to head back, but the path had changed. The trees were closer now, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground like grasping fingers. Panic set in as he tried to retrace his steps, only to find himself deeper in the forest with each turn. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms tall and thin, draped in tattered cloaks that blended with the darkness. Their faces were featureless, smooth and pale like porcelain masks, with hollow, black sockets where eyes should have been. They moved without sound, gliding over the forest floor as if weightless. Caleb froze, his breath hitching as one of the figures turned toward him. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if curious, and then it raised a spindly arm pointing at him. The chant grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to invade his mind. He ran. Branches tore at his clothes and skin as he stumbled through the forest, the Hollow Men gliding silently behind him. The chant followed him, growing more insistent, more commanding. Caleb's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. He tripped, falling hard against the cold earth, and for a moment all was silent. When he opened his eyes, he was surrounded. The hollow men stood in a perfect circle around him, their hollow sockets staring into his soul. One of them stepped forward, its cloak parting to reveal a skeletal hand clutching an object, a small, leather-bound book. It dropped the book at Caleb's feet, then reached out, its bony fingers brushing his forehead. An icy, searing pain shot through Caleb's skull, and his vision blurred. Images flooded his mind, rituals performed under blood-red moons, human sacrifices at stone altars, and the hollow men emerging from the earth, summoned by those desperate enough to bargain with them. When Caleb woke, he was lying at the edge of the black veil, the book clutched tightly in his hands. The forest was silent, and the sun was rising. He staggered back to his aunt's house, pale and trembling. Martha took one look at him and gasped. "They've marked you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't stop until they take you." Caleb didn't stay in Hollow Creek long after that. He left the town and tried to forget what had happened, but the book remained with him, no matter how many times he tried to burn or bury it. And at night, in his dreams, he heard the chant. Years later, Caleb disappeared without a trace. His apartment was empty, save for the book which lay open on his kitchen table. Its pages were blank except for a single sentence scrawled in blood-red ink: "The hollow men always collect their debts." The book vanished from the police evidence room soon after. No one knows where it went, but some say it has a way of finding those who are curious enough to seek it.
Story number 6.
The town of Ebon Hollow was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever. The residents kept to themselves, wary of strangers and quick to warn of the town's peculiar rule. Never look into the windows of the old Blackstone Manor. The manor was perched on the highest hill overlooking the town. A decaying structure with shattered windows and a roof that sagged as if the house itself was weary. Generations of children had dared each other to approach it, but few made it past the rusted iron gate. Rumors swirled about the house, that it was cursed, that something lived inside, and that anyone who peered through its windows would be claimed by the reflection. Cassie, a freelance journalist, came to Ebon Hollow looking for inspiration. She was fascinated by small-town folklore, and the legend of Blackstone Manor intrigued her. The townsfolk were tight-lipped when she asked about it, offering only terse warnings and nervous glances. Her curiosity burned brighter with every vague response, and she decided to investigate the manor herself. It was dusk when Cassie arrived at the gates. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that seemed to press down on her. The gate creaked open with little resistance, as though it had been waiting for her. She stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the house, her camera in hand and her heart pounding. The front door was ajar, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the last light of the setting sun. The house smelled of mildew and decay, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. She began snapping pictures, documenting the eerie beauty of the abandoned manor. As she moved through the rooms, she noticed something odd. Every mirror in the house was intact, spotless despite the grime that coated everything else. They hung in nearly every room, their frames ornate and gilded, reflecting the dim light with unsettling clarity. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, Cassie found a diary on a crumbling desk. Its leather cover was brittle, and the pages were yellowed with age. The entries were written in an elegant hand, chronicling the life of a woman named Eleanor Blackstone. Eleanor wrote of her loneliness in the manor after her husband's mysterious death, her growing obsession with the mirrors, and the strange sensation that she was being watched. The final entry read, "I see it now, in the corners of my vision. It is not my reflection. It is waiting, watching, growing stronger. I fear I am not alone in this house." A chill ran down Cassie's spine as she closed the diary. She felt an inexplicable urge to look into the mirror on the far wall, its surface catching the glow of her flashlight. She hesitated, remembering the warnings, but curiosity overpowered caution. Slowly, she turned her head toward the mirror. At first, she saw only her own reflection. But then, something shifted. The figure in the mirror didn't mimic her movements. Instead, it tilted its head, its eyes glinting with malice. Its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin that didn't belong to her. Cassie stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The reflection began to claw at the glass, its grin widening as cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched screech that made her ears ring. Panicked, Cassie turned to flee, but every mirror she passed showed the same grinning figure, now stepping out of the glass. She could hear its heavy, wet footsteps behind her, its breathing ragged and close. She made it to the front door, throwing it open and tumbling onto the porch. The night was silent, the stars overhead cold and indifferent. Cassie looked back at the house, but the windows were dark and empty. She returned to town, shaken but alive. Her camera was gone, and the diary had vanished from her bag. When she tried to explain what she'd seen, the townsfolk grew pale and refused to speak to her. The next morning, Cassie left Ebon Hollow, vowing never to return. Weeks later, she began to notice strange things. Her bathroom mirror would fog over, revealing handprints that didn't belong to her. Reflections in windows seemed to linger a moment too long. And at night, as she lay in bed, she could feel something watching her from the darkness. The final straw came when she glanced at her hallway mirror and saw the grinning figure standing just behind her. Cassie disappeared that night, leaving behind a shattered mirror and a single word scrawled in her handwriting on the wall: run. Blackstone Manor still stands, its windows dark and silent. The people of Ebon Hollow whisper that the reflection is always looking for its next victim, waiting for someone foolish enough to gaze into its domain. And every so often a stranger arrives in town, drawn by the legend, never to be seen again.